On the morning of 14th October 1943, a formation of American B-17 bombers crossed the German coastline and turned inland toward one of the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The mission was part of the daylight bombing campaign against the German aircraft industry, and the objective that day was the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The route had been flown before. The risks were already known. What was less certain was whether the formations would survive long enough to reach the target again. Long-range fighter escort could accompany the bombers only part of the way. Beyond that point, the formations would be alone. German radar would track them. Fighter units would be vectored toward them. Anti-aircraft batteries would already be waiting along the expected approach corridors. Every crew understood the sequence. What none of them knew was how long their own aircraft would remain intact once the interceptions began. Among the aircraft in the formation was a B-17 from the 8th Air Force, flying at high altitude in the middle of its combat box. Position inside the formation mattered. Mutual defensive fire from multiple bombers created overlapping arcs of machine gun coverage. An aircraft in the center was statistically more likely to survive fighter attacks than those on the edges. But position alone did not guarantee safety. German fighter tactics were designed specifically to break the integrity of the formation, isolate damaged bombers, and finish them once they fell behind. The first interceptions began shortly after the formation crossed into German airspace. Fighters approached head-on, a tactic developed to minimize exposure to defensive guns and maximize closing speed. At these velocities, the engagement lasted only seconds. Cannon fire flashed across the sky. Aircraft passed through each other's formations, and then the fighters were gone, already turning for another attack. Inside the B-17, the crew could see the results immediately. Bombers ahead of them were trailing smoke. One aircraft broke formation and began to fall away. Another exploded in a brief flash that left nothing but debris drifting behind the formation. The defensive guns fired continuously, but the German attacks did not stop. They came again, this time from above and behind. For several minutes, the aircraft held its position. Then the first hit came. The impact was not catastrophic, but it was heavy enough to shake the entire airframe. The flight engineer reported fuel loss from the outboard tank. Seconds later, another burst struck the right wing. A third hit damaged the radio compartment. None of the systems had failed completely, but the aircraft was no longer intact in the way it had been minutes earlier. At this stage of the mission, the formation was still far from the target. The pilot had two options. He could try to maintain position despite the damage, keeping the aircraft inside the protective structure of the combat box, or he could reduce power to protect the damaged engine and accept that the aircraft would begin to fall behind. Maintaining formation increased exposure to further attack. Falling behind meant isolation. He chose to stay with the formation. For the next 10 minutes, the aircraft absorbed additional hits. One engine began running rough. The oxygen system in the rear compartment was partially compromised. The tail gunner reported damage to his controls but remained operational. Each system failure was manageable on its own. Together they began to reduce the aircraft's margin for survival. The real problem came next. As the formation approached the target area, German fighters began attacking in larger numbers, coordinated with heavy anti-aircraft fire. The sky ahead filled with bursts of flak, black clouds that hung at the exact altitude of the bombers. Flying through them was unavoidable. Climbing or descending would break formation. Turning was not an option. The B-17 entered the flak field at the same moment the next fighter attack began. A direct hit struck the aircraft near the wing root. This time the damage was immediate and severe. One engine caught fire. Hydraulic pressure dropped. The aircraft lurched sideways, losing position within the formation. The pilot attempted to correct, but the bomber was already drifting out of alignment. Within seconds, the formation moved ahead. The aircraft was now alone. Isolation changed the situation completely. German fighter doctrine prioritized stragglers because they could be attacked repeatedly without interference from overlapping defensive fire. The B-17 was no longer protected by the combat box. It was now a single target moving through defended airspace. The first attack on the isolated aircraft came less than a minute later. Two fighters approached from the rear quarter, closing slowly to avoid the remaining defensive guns. The gunners opened fire early, forcing them to break off, but the message was clear. The aircraft had been identified. More attacks would follow. Inside the bomber, the crew began to understand the scale of the problem. The damaged engine fire had been contained, but the propeller could not be feathered completely. Drag from the engine reduced airspeed. The aircraft was now flying slower than the rest of the formation, which meant the distance between them would continue to increase. Turning back immediately might have reduced exposure time over Germany, but the aircraft was still near the target area, deep inside defended territory. At reduced speed and altitude, a direct return route would cross multiple known fighter bases. The pilot made a different decision. He kept the aircraft on the planned withdrawal heading. That decision created the next problem. Flying the planned route meant remaining inside German airspace for nearly 90 minutes. During that time, the aircraft would be alone. The next interception began as expected. Fighters approached from above this time, diving through the bomber's defensive arcs and firing at close range. The tail gunner engaged first. One fighter broke away trailing smoke. Another continued the attack and scored hits along the fuselage. A third pass destroyed the top turret's electrical system. The aircraft was still flying, but its defensive capability was shrinking. At this point, the situation should have ended quickly. A heavily damaged bomber alone over Germany, with reduced speed and limited defensive firepower, was exactly the type of target Luftwaffe units were trained to destroy efficiently. Instead, the engagement began to change. The pilot adjusted altitude slightly, descending into a layer of thin haze. Visibility dropped just enough to make visual tracking more difficult for intercepting fighters. It also reduced the accuracy of defensive gunners. The decision traded firepower for concealment. For several minutes, no fighters appeared. Then another pair arrived, this time approaching cautiously rather than aggressively. The difference was subtle but important. The B-17 was no longer behaving like a stable combat aircraft. Its damaged engines produced uneven exhaust. Sections of the fuselage were torn open. Control inputs caused delayed or exaggerated responses. From a distance, the aircraft appeared unstable. Luftwaffe pilots had learned that damaged bombers could be unpredictable. Explosions, structural failure, or sudden loss of control could turn a close attack into a collision hazard. Several fighters made long observation passes before committing to another firing run. This hesitation bought the crew time. Inside the aircraft, the navigator recalculated their position. The direct route back to England was no longer feasible at the current speed and altitude. Fuel consumption had increased because of the damaged engine and partial hydraulic failure. If they attempted to climb back to formation altitude, the aircraft might stall or lose another engine. Remaining low increased fuel efficiency, but it created another risk. Low altitude meant exposure to light anti-aircraft guns and small arms fire as they crossed occupied territory. The pilot chose to stay low. That decision began the longest phase of the flight. For the next hour, the aircraft moved slowly westward, no longer part of a bombing formation, no longer protected by escorts, and still deep inside hostile airspace. The gunners remained at their stations. Even though ammunition was running low, the flight engineer monitored engine temperatures constantly. The radio operator attempted repeated contact with Allied controllers, but the damaged system transmitted only intermittently. At several points, German fighters reappeared, but their attacks were limited and cautious. Each pass risked flying into the unpredictable defensive arcs of a bomber that might break apart without warning. Each minute the aircraft remained airborne also moved it farther from major fighter concentration zones. The real danger was no longer interception. It was whether the aircraft itself would hold together long enough to reach the coast. Structural damage along the wing had weakened the airframe. Control cables had been partially severed. The landing gear hydraulic system was no longer reliable. If the aircraft lost another engine, maintaining altitude would be impossible. By the time the navigator reported that the coastline was less than 20 minutes away, the B-17 had already been airborne for nearly 90 minutes after leaving the formation. But reaching the coast did not mean survival. The channel still lay ahead, and the aircraft no longer had enough power to climb. By the time the navigator reported the coastline ahead, the aircraft was no longer fighting German fighters. It was fighting its own condition. The B-17 was flying lower than any heavy bomber was designed to operate over enemy territory. One engine was producing only partial power. Another was running hot and consuming oil at a rate the flight engineer could not accurately measure because the gauge had been damaged during the earlier attack. Hydraulic pressure was nearly gone. Electrical systems functioned intermittently. The airframe itself had begun to vibrate in a way that suggested structural fatigue rather than turbulence. The coast appeared through the haze sooner than expected, but reaching it created a new problem. German air defense did not end at the shoreline. Low-altitude anti-aircraft batteries protected ports, radar stations, and coastal gun positions. A damaged bomber moving slowly and alone across the coastline presented an easy target. Climbing to altitude might have reduced exposure time, but the aircraft no longer had the power margin to do it safely. The pilot kept the aircraft low. As they crossed the shoreline, scattered bursts of light flak appeared below. The fire was inaccurate and poorly coordinated, likely the result of local batteries reacting without centralized control. Even so, the crew understood that a single hit in the wing or control system could end the flight immediately. The gunners, now low on ammunition, watched for fighters but did not fire unless absolutely necessary. Every round left had to be reserved for a close interception. No fighters appeared. The next challenge came from the aircraft itself. Fuel consumption had been calculated based on the assumption that the damaged engine could maintain partial efficiency. As the channel came into view, the flight engineer realized that the aircraft had less fuel remaining than expected. Increased drag from the unfeathered propeller and structural damage had forced higher power settings on the remaining engines. The margin for reaching England was now uncertain. The pilot had two options. He could reduce power to conserve fuel and risk losing altitude over open water, or he could maintain speed and accept that the engines might run dry before landfall. He chose to maintain speed. The decision reflected a basic calculation. A controlled ditching in the channel was possible, but survival rates for heavy bomber crews ditching damaged aircraft in cold water were low. Rescue units might not reach them in time. If the aircraft could reach the English coast at any altitude, even minimal, the chances of survival increased significantly. For the next 15 minutes, the aircraft flew straight and level over open water. The vibration continued. The control inputs required to maintain heading became larger and slower as hydraulic pressure dropped further. At one point, the right wing dipped unexpectedly, forcing the pilot to compensate manually using differential engine power. Inside the fuselage, the crew remained at their stations despite the growing awareness that if structural failure occurred over the channel, there would be no warning and little chance of escape. Then the first engine began to fail. The loss was gradual rather than sudden. Oil pressure dropped. The temperature rose beyond the marked limits. The flight engineer reported the condition to the pilot, but there was no practical way to shut the engine down without losing critical thrust. The aircraft was already flying close to its minimum controllable speed. For several minutes, the engine continued to run at reduced power. Then it began to misfire. The aircraft started to descend. The pilot ordered all non-essential equipment shut down to reduce electrical load and drag. Crew members shifted forward to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity within limits. The navigator recalculated distance to land repeatedly. Each time, the estimate showed the same problem. They were going to reach the coast at very low altitude. The English shoreline appeared ahead just as the failing engine lost most of its power. At this point, the crew faced another decision. Attempting to climb even slightly to clear coastal terrain risked stalling the aircraft completely. Remaining low meant crossing the shoreline at an altitude that left almost no room for maneuver. The pilot chose to stay low. The aircraft crossed the coast at an altitude estimated later to be less than 300 feet. British air defense units had already tracked the incoming radar contact and identified it as a friendly aircraft based on its flight path. Ground controllers attempted radio contact, but the B-17's damaged system transmitted only intermittent static. Emergency landing fields were identified along the aircraft's projected route, but the pilot could not hear the instructions clearly enough to rely on them. Instead, he began searching visually. The next problem appeared almost immediately. The landing gear system was hydraulic. Hydraulic pressure was gone. Lowering the gear normally was no longer possible. The B-17 did have a manual emergency system, but it required time, physical effort, and stable flight conditions. At the current altitude and with engine power failing, time was limited. The crew began the manual extension procedure. The process took several minutes. During that time, the aircraft continued to descend slowly. The pilot kept the nose slightly down to maintain airspeed, knowing that a stall at this point would destroy the aircraft before the landing gear locked into position. The first gear indicator showed partial extension. The second took longer. The third failed to lock completely. The crew now faced another decision. Attempting to cycle the gear again risked losing the little altitude remaining. Landing with one gear partially extended risked a ground loop or structural collapse. The pilot chose to continue with the partial extension. A suitable landing field appeared ahead, already marked by emergency vehicles that had been alerted by radar tracking. The aircraft lined up at low altitude, descending steadily as the engine struggled to maintain power. At approximately 2 miles from the field, the second damaged engine failed completely. The aircraft was now operating on minimal power from the remaining engines, barely maintaining controlled flight. The pilot did not attempt to go around. There was no longer enough power for one. The final approach was shallow and fast. Without full hydraulic control, flap extension was limited. The aircraft crossed the field boundary at higher speed than normal and touched down hard. The partially extended landing gear collapsed almost immediately. The B-17 slid across the ground on its damaged structure, throwing debris behind it as the fuselage scraped along the surface. The aircraft veered slightly but remained upright, finally coming to rest after several hundred meters. There was no fire. For several seconds, the crew remained in their positions, waiting for the impact they expected to follow. When none came, they began shutting down what remained of the electrical system and evacuating through the nearest exits. Ground personnel reached the aircraft within minutes. Inspection later showed the extent of the damage. The fuselage had been hit repeatedly by cannon fire and flak fragments. Control cables had been partially severed and repaired in flight using emergency procedures. One wing spar had been weakened but had not failed. 2 engines were beyond repair. Hydraulic lines had been ruptured in multiple locations. The aircraft had remained airborne for approximately 90 minutes after leaving formation, much of that time alone over hostile territory. From a technical perspective, the survival of the aircraft was not the result of a single factor. The B-17's structural redundancy allowed it to absorb damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fire. Multiple control paths allowed partial operation even after cables were damaged, but design alone did not explain the outcome. The aircraft survived because of a sequence of decisions made under pressure: staying with the formation despite early damage, remaining on the planned withdrawal route instead of turning immediately, descending into haze to reduce interception risk, maintaining speed over the channel despite fuel uncertainty, continuing toward land rather than preparing for ditching, attempting manual gear extension rather than landing immediately without it. Each decision carried risk. None guaranteed survival, but each preserved a small margin that allowed the aircraft to continue flying long enough to reach friendly territory. Luftwaffe interception reports from that day recorded multiple damaged bombers leaving the formation area, most of which were destroyed before reaching the coast. The survival of this aircraft was not typical. It represented the outer limit of what a damaged heavy bomber and its crew could sustain. The aircraft itself was later written off as a total loss. The crew was not. In the broader context of the air war over Europe, the significance of the flight was not its rarity, but what it demonstrated about the evolving balance between aircraft durability, crew decision-making, and the limits of interception. German fighters could break formations and inflict severe losses, but once a damaged aircraft moved beyond concentrated interception zones and continued to function structurally, the probability of survival increased with every mile west. For the crew, the 90-minute flight did not feel like survival through design or doctrine. It felt like 90 minutes in which the aircraft should have stopped flying. But it did not, and that was enough.